We'd like to begin, and begin as we do all things in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Lord Jesus, in these moments together, help us to contemplate with depth and perception and a consciousness of your grace, the beauty that you've infused into the world, the truth to which you summon us, and the good deeds to which you call us on the path of holiness. This we pray in the name of Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Amen. So welcome to this, what I hope will be a lively panel discussion on how to read and write like a Catholic. We named this panel after a remarkable new book by Joshua Wren, my new colleague and the co-founder of the MFA in Creative Writing at the University of St. Thomas. I'm wondering, should I be standing up for? I think I need to. Yeah. As I said, we named this panel after a remarkable new book by my colleague at the University of St. Thomas, Joshua Wren, who's my new colleague and co-founder of this new MFA program at the University of St. Thomas, which we're very proud to say is the first Master of Fine Arts program in creative writing that is intended to form all of its students in the cosmic scope and the great enduring depths of the Catholic literary and intellectual tradition. In our time together, we want to discuss that book, but chiefly as a way into entering into the provocative questions that it raises. We all know from popular tradition that it's possible to drink like a Catholic. But is there such a thing as reading and writing like a Catholic? And if so, what does that tell us about Catholicism, about literature and its vocation? And even what does that tell us about the nature of things in general, extending beyond the relatively self-enclosed, not to say self-regarding world of the literary? Before we proceed, I want to introduce myself and the speakers in the order that they will be sharing their initial comments with us, though we're hoping to have time for plenty of discussion. I'm James Matthew Wilson, Cullen Foundation Chair of English Literature at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. I'm the founding director of the Master of Fine Arts program, Creative Writing, a program that's newly born, 9 weeks old, no diapers, and truth be told, though, it's the child of Joshua's enterprising imagination. Our other discussants today, in the order of their presentation, will be Joshua, founder and editor of Wise Blood Books, and co-founder of the MFA at the University of St. Thomas. He's published numerous essays and poems in such journals as First Things in America, Public Discourse, and Logos. Joshua's books include Middle Earth and The Return of the Common Good, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Political Philosophy. The story collections, This Our Exile and In the Wine Press, and of course, How to Read and Write Like a Catholic. Also, though, his book of poems, First Things, Last Things, and Other Lost Causes, will appear this year from Little Gidding Press. Joshua's novel Infinite Regress and his theological, aesthetical manifesto, Contemplative Realism, are forthcoming in 2022. Jessica Hooten-Wilson is the Louise Cowan Scholar in Residence at the University of Dallas.
We're not related.
No. Oh, thank you for...
You say that like it would be a terrible thing.
I suppose when you've been asked for the 10th time, so what's your wife publishing these days, you might want to make this distinction, but I didn't think to do it. Yes, yes.
I've just heard it all day today.
Yes. I've known her for most of my life as Jessica Hooten, and so it didn't occur to me but until that question started coming up. Okay, so Jessica Hooten-Wilson, unrelated, is the Louise Cowan Scholar in Residence at the University of Dallas. She's the author of Giving the Devil His Due, Flannery O'Connor and the Brothers Karamazov, which received the 2018 Christianity Today Book of the Year Award in the Culture and Arts, as well as 2 books on Walker Percy, The Search for Influence, Walker Percy and Fyodor Dostoevsky, and Reading Walker Percy's Novels. Most recently, she co-edited Solzhenitsyn and American Culture, The Russian Soul in the West. Christopher Beha is the editor of Harper's Magazine and the author of 4 books, among them the novels What Happened to Sophie Wilder and The Index of Self-Destructive Acts, which was nominated for the National Book Award and the Gotham Book Prize, and since I have it, I'm going to hold it up here. I have Jessica's books too at home, but they're on the shelf. I should have brought them. I could have made this a very incarnate presentation. Just a week ago tomorrow, I was sitting in San Francisco's St. Mary's Cathedral. The Archbishop Cordileone had commissioned sacred music composer Frank LaRocca to write a Requiem Mass for the homeless. LaRocca had fulfilled the task with brilliance, and perhaps never more so than in the extended piece he composed to be played immediately following the Eucharist. There, LaRocca's music soared into harmony, but then descended into dissonance to represent the disorientation of those forgotten persons that we had only to step outside of the cathedral to see standing in the streets of San Francisco. After the Mass, my own litany for the patron saints of the homeless was prayed in the cathedral square before a procession marched down the street from the cathedral to St. Anthony's, a soup kitchen run by the Franciscan Brothers. That evening, a professor at St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park delivered a striking lecture where he tied the nature of beauty to human dignity. Beauty not as luxury goods for the few, but as the lux, the light by which the human person fully alive is seen in his humanity and duly honored. As Joshua observes in his book, it's specifically through the portal of beauty that Catholics have traditionally taken up the themes of literature and the fine arts, and with good reason. But there's more to be said than this, he argues. And I'd like to make just 3 brief points in that regard under the rubrics of secularity now, beauty, and the Christic imagination before I turn things over to our presenters. How to read like a Catholic in the widest possible scope raises the perennial question of the relationship of nature and grace. Is there a kind of purely natural reading, a secular practice of reading that has its own integrity, proper method, and end? Does grace superimpose upon it? Is to read like a Catholic to read with the eyes of faith, but also to recognize that its deliverances will be illegible to those who lack them? These questions would seem at first to resolve in the affirmative. Joshua's exploration of the question in the early pages of his book begins with Cardinal Newman, who speaks of literature as a kind of historical record of the natural man, man in rebellion, the panoply of human actions, most of which are best unedifying in themselves, but revelatory of the wide berth depravity gives to itself on the stage of history. He cites Lukács, the great Marxist theorist of the novel, who refers to the novel as the epic of a world abandoned by God. He further cites Jody Bottom and others who view the true subject of the novel to be psychology in the modern sense of that term, the interior dynamics of the self cut off from any larger order. He also quotes the Catholic novelist Donna Tartt, who speaks of the novel as emphatically secular. In support of these claims, we might further recall Aquinas' passage on the relative independence of a body of knowledge or the practice of an art from the moral rectitude of the person. Jacques Mariton's Art and Scholasticism begins with just this point, as the point of departure for the whole volume, Art and Scholasticism, in an effort to probe the connection, if any, between artistic work and spiritual salvation. This would lead Flannery O'Connor, a great admirer of Mariton, to give one of her finest cheek-biting aphorisms in Mystery and Manners. The Catholic novelist doesn't have to be a saint. He doesn't even have to be a Catholic. He does, unfortunately, have to be a novelist. That line's 60 years old. Thank you for laughing. Without disputing there being significant truth in all of these claims, we can still affirm, as Joshua does, that they do not answer the question from the deepest principle of literature. In fact, Joshua argues, by way of quotation from Christopher Beha, that the stage of the human drama that is the novel intrinsically opens onto the plot of sin and of salvation. It's not merely the case that literary representation, as the representation of human nature and human acts, might include those aspects of history and experience that are thematically religious. It's simply the case that the setting into action of character and plot in principle opens onto the reality that conditions life in this world and judges it. The novel cannot be emphatically secular because there's no such place as the secular. Many here will recall Alistair MacIntyre's argument more than a decade ago that Catholic universities critique secular universities not merely in their failure to be Catholic, but insofar as, in failing to be Catholic, they fail to be universities. The secular novel would similarly seem to fail to be a novel, but that failure never occurs because the novel of itself cannot help but open onto the divine, open onto the stage of salvation. Nature insists upon the reality of grace by interior reflection on its own incompletion. So beauty. If that's the case, then is there any point in asking how to read and write like a Catholic? Why ponder something you can't help but doing? Joshua's answer draws, as it were, Newman and Pope Benedict together. Literature moves dialogically between the terrible record of natural man and the salvific promise of beauty. Terror and redemption, evil's darkness opening onto the looks of the good. This is clearly a compelling account of how that stage of salvation actually appears in literature and in the world. I'd answer in a somewhat different manner, however. Joshua's account of beauty quotes Etienne Gilson in support of the idea of the beautiful representation of ugly things. But in general, Joshua refers to the via pulchritudinis, as the way out of the ugly. That is to say, as light, as perfection, or even as the merely pretty. In fact, however, the church speaks of beauty as a property of being. Beauty is not understood as a perfection that contrasts with the ugly as a positive reality. Rather, it's something that's proper to being as such, and that contrasts only with what does not exist. Beauty as property of being stands in contrast with non-being. When we take this definition seriously, and I'm afraid it's one that's more often observed in principle than in reality, we discover something. It's not only on account of the human character and action present in literature that the novel of necessity opens onto the stage of salvation. It's rather in virtue of literature's being anything at all. Beauty, understood as a property of being, is the form and splendor, the integrity and light by which existence gives itself away. Beauty is being's self-gift to other being. Beauty is simply the disclosure of form as existing. The fine arts, then, are just those arts that have for their end the manifestation of being, of the real. They are distinctive, not to say unique, paths by which we see the things that things are in themselves, that their own integrity is real, and that their integrity stands in relation to other beings and to being itself. Their source is God. Only because this is the case, the knowledge of this finite thing here can be a pathway by which the mind arises to the knowledge of other things and to the principle of thingness itself. If the secular itself is a myth, then the encounter with things of itself leads us into them, through them, and beyond them. Joshua's account teaches the same conclusion by slightly different paths, and that leads to the illuminating and delightful chapters he gives us in the subsequent parts of his book. It's a big book. It contains multitudes. He shows us the ways Catholic writers realize the full economy of being in their work. He attends also and extensively to those writers whose background or themes are loosely indebted to Catholicism. George Saunders, for instance, was a childhood Catholic who appreciates the symbolic and aesthetic power of the church's practice, while for himself, he prefers Buddhism. Rather than soft pedaling around apostasy, Joshua delves into Saunders' great insights on literature and shows us how, by their own manifest being, they ought to lead Saunders' thought beyond where it actually ends. Joshua trusts being to manifest the truth about itself and critique those who would evade its intrinsic implications. So also, in the final parts of his book, he offers a primer in the art of fiction and attends to the ways that craft opens onto epiphany and literary form onto the truth about being. What one can gain from these studies is a clear sense that to read and write like a Catholic is to be one who does so with attention to the whole. That the emphatically secular is a kind of evasion, or as Maritain would have put it, a forgetfulness of being. The Catholic writer must be just what Hans Urs von Balthasar once proclaimed every Christian ought to be, the guardian of metaphysics in our time. As John Paul II writes in Fides et Ratio, it is only through preserving the concern for being, and so also the sapiential dimension of the human being in a philosophy, that human reason finds the fullness of truth about the person as a whole, and theology in particular can be seen with clarity. One last note, the Christic Imagination. It's not a footnote, the Christic Imagination. Joshua speaks frequently in the volume of this term. Attention to the whole is impossible if it does not occur by staring upon the cross and seeing in the broken form of Christ the fullness of the Logos. In this sense, there will be, as it were, a secular literature just there is nature unilluminated by grace. It's only in the pierced hands and feet of Christ that we see such darkness is already calling out for light. To read and write like a Catholic is simply to see what was already there and to know how to speak of it and even to know what to do about it. But as I stand here before you now, I think that this is much too difficult a thing to do than I've made it out to be, and so I want to turn things over to those who might be in a better position to explain it.
Thank you so much, James. And it is a big book, and I just want to remark that it's also a sort of self-defense tool. So if you want to put yourself through all of the taxing discipline of learning karate for years and maybe even decades, right, you can take that approach. Otherwise, you could just buy this hardcover book and carry it around and throw it at someone in the case that you're attacked. So I want to begin just by reading a very brief excerpt from How to Read and Write Like a Catholic, which pertains to Alistair MacIntyre's critique of the understanding of human dignity, especially in modern moral theory. And then I'll go on to sort of three angles or aspects wherein Catholic imagination and Catholic literature intersect with the question of human dignity. So in Dostoevsky's novel, The Adolescent, he explores the question of what he calls the Geneva ideas. These Geneva ideas are espoused by Versilov, the revolutionary father of the protagonist Arkady. And these ideas, as Versilov explains them, underlie today's civilization and are founded upon the possibility of virtue without Christ. In a somewhat contradictory but frank and perceptive moment, he confesses that human beings are, to him, vile, but one can do good on their behalf by clenching your feelings, holding your nose, and shutting your eyes. This last is especially necessary. Endure evil from them, not getting angry with them if possible, remembering that you too are a human being. As he clarifies, with startling cynicism, to love one's neighbor and not to despise him is impossible. In my opinion, Versilov says, man is created with a physical inability to love his neighbor. There's some mistake in the words here from the very beginning, and love for mankind should be understood as just for that mankind which you yourself have created in your own soul. In other words, you've created or imagined your own self into being in such a way that makes you lovable and that allows you to love other people. You are prescribing your own self and extending that image of yourself to others, making them, therefore, having this kind of pseudo-dignity. Versolov is, as you probably won't be surprised, unable to break through emotionally to others. And he remains in that state even when he undertakes ends that are objectively morally good. As Nikolai Rezensky notes, the crucial ideological point that Versolov is advancing here is the concept that man invents himself to love himself. For this moral psychological gesture, Versolov suggests, is what is real, while abstractions in the order of mankind never really existed. The argument rests on self-involvement and self-imposed morality, in which there are no transcendent objects such as God or merger with mankind. The process of love, symbolized by Christ, is dispensed with, and all that remains is the vision of man standing completely alone and shaping himself into a superior being. On the one hand, Rezensky enunciates the self-imposed character of Versolov's morality. Pierre Manent, in his book A World Beyond Politics, traces this idea to Kant. If, for Thomas Aquinas, human dignity consists in freely obeying the natural and divine laws, so that you grow in dignity insofar as you obey those laws, and as Alistair McIntyre was remarking, you have the possibility of losing that same dignity insofar as you do not obey those laws. Juxtapose this with Kant, who argues that dignity consists in obeying laws and conceptions of ourselves that we give to ourselves, that we invent and prescribe for ourselves. According to the Christian comprehension of human beings, any dignity that exists comes as a gift from God, for only God is capable of granting us power to follow our counsel. In other words, if we have dignity, it's because we're made in the image and likeness of God, and only for that reason. For Kant, on the other hand, the difference is both radical and subtle. As Pierre Manent says, to be human is a dignity. I think in this regard of St. Augustine's remarks in the city, I'm a Catholic, so I can cite scripture without knowing the chapter and verse, and I can cite Augustine without knowing where the heck this is in City of God, or if it is even in City of God. But I think of St. Augustine's remarks somewhere in City of God, find it if you can, and in Aquinas' treatise on law, at the end of the treatise on law, where he says that although human beings are made in God's image, sure, in some of us, and myself included, that image is harder to see. In fact, it's quite dimmed. Literature tackles this as a wonderful gift and problem. How does literature broadly, and the Catholic imagination specifically, countenance and render that dimness? How does it presence or allude to the measure, dignity, by which we would begin to recognize dimness of that dignity as dimness? If Newman is right, and literature is largely a record of man in rebellion, then one of the main ways to frame literature or literary arcs would be to follow characters as they move from dignity to loss thereof. I think, for example, of Mrs. Turpin from Flannery O'Connor's story Revelation, who ends up identifying herself with a warthog, specifically a warthog from hell. And as Alistair McIntyre notes, Aquinas argues that if you act in such a way that you lose your dignity, you become not just beast-like, but in fact worse than a beast. And you get a taste of that in Flannery's image here. It's not just a warthog, it's a warthog from hell, right? And it is precisely this understanding of herself as a warthog from hell that allows her to begin to regenerate and be recovered from that loss of dignity. What does it look like on the page? Does a Catholic vision make it more likely that literature will be steadfastly able to recognize human dignity even in unexpected places and people? On the one hand, I would say maybe not. I think of David Foster Wallace's remark that there are aspects of contemporary American life that make it hard, really hard, to be human. And that in dark times, the task of literature is to perform CPR on those aspects of human being that are still glowing. But is this glowing that remains in spite of darkness the same thing as genuine dignity? How do we determine which things are glowing that should be narrated into existence? Still further, I would argue that the Catholic imagination oftentimes doesn't perform CPR to these aspects of human beings that are glowing, but presents the absence of what should be there, and that in potentiality still exists. I think, for example, of Dante in The Realm of the Gluttonous, where he describes their eyes seeming like a ring that's lost its gems, and he who would read the OMO, the Italian word for man, in their faces would recognize the M. So these souls of the gluttonous being purged are so emaciated that all you can see is part of the word man and not all of the word in its entirety, because these beings have lost their humanity, they've lost their dignity. In Randy Boyagoda's novel, Dante's Indiana, published earlier this year, he presences a number of people who are walking around in an Indiana parking lot who the protagonist first mistakes as chewing gum, and then when he looks closer, realizes that they have these vacant shadows around their eyes and that they're not actually chewing gum, but chewing pills. These are meth addicts and painkiller addicts. And the way that he presences them is so chilling and haunting that it stayed with me for days and directed me towards that which needs to have CPR performed on it by us outside of the text, rather than elevating these souls for us within the text and lending them some sort of dignity, because they, in fact, had seemingly lost it. The last remarks that I'll make for now are just pertain to Christopher Beha's novels and the question of dignity and portraying its presence and loss in them. I think, for example, of Frank Doyle, one of the main characters in the Index of Self-Destructive Acts. And Frank Doyle is not a sort of nothing who needs to have the spotlight shined on him, like, let's say, the heroines of George Eliot's or Henry James' novel, where if the novel wasn't being told about these protagonists, there's a way in which their lives would just sort of disappear for us, right? We would see them. We wouldn't see them. We wouldn't know their significance. Frank Doyle is famous, right? But he's also come into disgrace by making an impropitious and wrongful racial remark at a baseball game while drunk. But while the rest of the culture sort of cancels him, the novel continues to lend him dignity, going so far as to present his deathbed scene, right? And I'd love to hear Chris's thoughts about the reason that he chose to include a deathbed scene where Frank, who is guilty of no small laundry list of wrongs, begins to repent of those wrongs and then mistakes his daughter for a recording angel. Is this an elevation into a dignity that he's won by repentance, or is it a kind of aesthetical salvation, giving him something that he hasn't he's not in a place to receive on his own? And then I'll also bring up What Happened to Sophie Wilder, which, if you haven't read it, something's wrong. No. It's one of the best novels of the 21st century, and in particular, the interaction of Sophie and her father-in-law, Crane. Crane is estranged from Sophie's husband. Sophie is also estranged from her husband because her husband is actually engaged in an affair with a law office intern. But in spite of these double estrangements, Sophie, who has, midway through the novel, become occupied by God to the point that she converts to the Catholic faith, she is caring for Crane, although she knows that her own husband conceives of him as a monster. She provides that presence that the panel on Death with Dignity spoke of as being lacking in so many human lives at near death, where the loved ones are just gone and you are alone. Crane is bitterly angry with God. He conceives of God as a tyrant, and he lashes out against her, even in her heroic generosity to be with him. And there's a sense in which Sophie gains dignity in this novel, not because of anything that she's doing in particular, but because it aligns her with the Christian vision of telos, of salvation, right? This is a character who's being weighed as moving closer to her salvation. But as she faces the suffering of Crane more and more, there's a question in terms of what exactly happens, and I'd like to hear Chris's thoughts on this again, because she gives into his demands to be drugged, basically to the point that she hastens his death. And in so doing, she conceives of herself as having committed an unforgivable sin, that what she has done can no longer be redeemed. And again, so there's a way in which you could read the novel as she has actually recognized that he needs to die a dignified death of getting out of his pain, so that she gives him these painkillers and now he's dignified and he can go out peacefully. Or it's possible that in attempting to show this kind of pseudo-compassion, she commits, right, an infraction and moves away from that dignity that could have been gained.
I'm going to stand for the sake of everyone over here. When I was newly able to read, I read a book that might be familiar to a lot of people, Margaret Wise Brown's The Golden Egg book. Nod your head if you're with me. A lot of moms are with me. So it's about a golden egg, and there's a little bunny who finds the egg. And he thinks, what's inside the egg? And so, as a bunny would do, he pushes the egg down a hill. He throws a rock at the egg, all trying to figure out what's inside of the egg. And he conjectures, maybe it's an elephant, maybe it's a mouse, maybe it's a little boy, maybe it's another bunny. And then he gets so tired of this experiment that he falls asleep. The egg hatches, and lo and behold, it's a duck. And they go off, kind of into the sunset, happily ever after. This is the book that made me want to write. And the reason why is I was so mad that it was a duck that came out of that egg. And I thought, I could do better than that. If I was writing this book, it would be like an alien or a demon or an angel or something cool would come out of that egg, right? And then the encounter would change entirely. I'm bringing up this story because I think this is what we often forget about writing and reading. They are not individual activities. Writing responds to other writing. Dan Taylor, who's a novelist, he says to his writing students, how did it feel when you first discovered writing? You just put pen to paper? It was just this experiment all on your own that you just started, this craft? Well, of course not. We have this misconception that we are originators, that we just out of nowhere have to come up with these thoughts. We have to come up with what we're going to create. It's an ex nihilo process, right? And the Catholic tradition defies that idea of writing in every aspect. Just like McIntyre said a second ago, we have to fight the conception of the human person as an individualist. Writing should be a communal activity. It should be something in which you're responding to what's gone before, and you know that you're passing it on to what comes after you, and you're sharing it with those who are within your community. I think one of the reasons that we've lost this has to do with our loss of tradition altogether. If you saw the Lord of the Rings movie, don't you love the opening of it? And I wish it was actually in the novel, but it's not, so I have to quote it from the movie. But Galadriel says, "Some things that ought not to have been forgotten were lost." This is what we've forgotten about our tradition, is that writing does not happen all by yourself. Walker Percy, one of the novelists that I write on all the time, he says, when he set out to write The Moviegoer, he found that he landed squarely in a tradition that went back to Augustine and Dante without consciously ever doing that. When he was trying to find his voice, he best found his voice because of all that he had read that had made him who he was, and the things that he now saw the world through those eyes. And that's the lens that he took on reality. So what does that mean for the Catholic writer? Well, in part, you're being formed by a tradition, and in part, you're being formed by Scripture. So on the tradition side of things, Mary Caruthers, who is a medievalist, if you haven't read her book of memory or The Craft of Thought, get thee to a bookstore, as Ralph Wood would say, right? Those two books are life-changing for understanding this process. And one of the things that Caruthers says that I just loved is that she said, we've misunderstood the 5 canons of rhetoric. What we thought was invention, organization, style, memory, and delivery. Which means if you walk into a creative writing class right now, you begin with invention. You begin with, you need to make something up. And instead, she said, what always preceded it in the medieval mind is you began with memory. And the word invention is actually more closely aligned with inventory. You took stock of what you already knew to pass down. And you think about all the great writers in the tradition, they did this without hesitation. You have Marie de France and the opening of her medieval lays saying, I'm going to tell you these stories that must be heard again afresh, and I'm going to write them in this way, right? You have Chaucer, and the way that students think of Chaucer is he stole from Dante and stole from Boccaccio. That's not the way they conceived of writing. It was taking what is true, good, and beautiful, what James said, and then passing it on. That the task of the writer was to rearrange those things, to have your style of those things, and then to deliver them on. But memory came first. So part of the memory is with tradition, responding to the best that has been thought and said and knowing it well. And we were actually talking up here earlier that a lot of that lens is missing even when you read contemporary fiction. Beha's books, or I just read Josh Friend's novel last night. If you don't know Dostoevsky, you're not going to get the fullness of what he's doing in his novel. It doesn't mean you have to go read Dostoevsky before you read Friend. I don't want to set up 800 pages before you get to his novel. But at the same time, that kind of tradition provides that lens so that you get more from what it is that you're reading. The other part, of course, is Scripture. Flannery O'Connor said the world would be a better place if everyone read the newspaper and the Bible every day. And the reason for the scriptural reading is because that biblical lens, that response, that you're responding to it, embodying it, and seeing everything that comes after you through that lens, right? Basil the Great talking to, the young men about why read Homer. Well, you read Homer through the lens of the Bible and you see, does it praise virtue and condemn vice? Then keep reading it because it's glossing the scripture for you. It's keeping those words alive. Every time that you are reading something, you are bringing life to that page. The responsibility for the readers to actually engage and inhabit that language and then to live it, right? To become incarnate words all around us. That is the call for the Christian. So Christian readers and writers are going to look different because they're not going to think of themselves autonomously. They're going to think of themselves as participating in a much larger vision, a much larger world. I want to conclude with a poem. And I'm leaving the most time for questions because I don't want to be a hypocrite. I just said that we need to have a conversation. So it wouldn't do if I stand up here and talk too long. I want to make sure that you get time for your questions. But the poem I want to end with, and again, I'm just highlighting this because I believe this is true and this is important. We do have to recognize our mentors and our teachers constantly. And for at least 3 of us on the panel, Dana Joya is a heavy influence on us. And he's the one who, when I first started speaking, said always recite a poem, read a poem, bring a poem. And so I'm going to do what my teacher told me to. And this is a poem on reading that is dedicated to the poet's influence. So it's doing what I'm suggesting here. It's by Amit Majmudar. It's called Reading for Jorge Luis Borges. I stand before the books as I might stand beneath the night sky. They're in stacks and stacks of self-contained infinities, demanding exploration. I have neither maps nor ladders to pursue these stars, these books that burn within themselves. And that's when he comes, and he shows me where to start. A blind librarian with a lantern and a hand that takes my own. He knows the books for me. He knows exactly where they are. When he points, I know at last where to look. The deep sky he navigates by heart. And as he shows them to me one by one, I find those stars opening into suns.
Being somewhat reserved in my clapping because I'm actually quite angry with you right now. Because that's a very tough act to follow. I'm not going to be doing any accent work, I don't think. But I am going to read a poem, which I wasn't going to do, but as it happens, a poem that I plan to cite and talk quite a bit about during my remarks, Joshua has brought with him. So that suggests that it is indeed relevant, and now I can look prepared. So it's a wonderful poem by W.H. Auden, which many of you probably know, called The Novelist. And it goes like this. Encased in talent like a uniform, the rank of every poet is well known. They can amaze us like a thunderstorm, or die so young, or live for years alone. They can dash forward like hussars, but he must struggle out of his boyish gift and learn how to be plain and awkward, how to be one after whom none think it worth to turn. For to achieve his lightest wish, he must become the whole of boredom, subject to vulgar complaints like love. Among the just, be just. Among the filthy, filthy too. And in his own weak person, if he can, must suffer dully all the wrongs of man. So I want to say first, I haven't been on a lot of academic panels before for the very good reason that I'm not an academic. And I feel a little bit out of my league. I'm the only one here who, I believe the only one who does not have a PhD. There are other practitioners on the panel, but I believe I'm the only one whose only credential is being a practitioner. I am also a critic, but I try to be a critic practitioner. When I write about novels, I write about them by and large as a novelist. And so it seems to me if I can be of any use to anyone here today, it can sort of be as a specimen. So I'm gonna speak a little bit about my personal experience as it relates to these questions, and I do think it brings a new perspective into some of these questions. I have really one remark which might seem sort of trivial, and then I have a broad subject matter which I'd like to introduce into the conversation that's going to follow. The remark is simply this. When I sit down to write, I do not sit down with the Catholic imagination. I sit down with my own imagination. That's all I've got. And of course, in a way, I have the tradition behind me. I think what Jessica has to say on that front is absolutely right. And I also think, well, I should say that that's not a criticism to the framing of the panel or anything like that, because I think that it's the critic's job after the fact to look at these things and draw commonalities between different writers, draw distinctions between different writers. I think that Eliot was probably right when he says that great writers are most individual precisely when they are most partaking of the tradition that they are from. I think that novelists themselves, out of ego or for whatever reason, are going to emphasize what is unique about them or their approach rather than, and may even try and cover their tracks when it comes to certain influences. But just as a matter of approach when sitting down to write, the question that one asks oneself is not what kind of novel would a Catholic write, or what kind of novel would the kind of Catholic I am write. You have your personal concerns and you work through them on the page. And just a slight autobiographical note, which may or may not be of interest, but I grew up in a devoutly Catholic family. I was a devout believer myself. I eventually left the church in young adulthood. I went through a period of being estranged, shall we say, from the church, and I ultimately returned. Now, the novel that I think is the reason why I was invited to be here, which is What Happened to Sophie Wilder, which is a novel that is very often identified as a Catholic novel, is a novel I wrote while I was not a Catholic. It was a novel I wrote precisely because I couldn't figure out why this tradition still had this hold on me, even though I had done everything I could to reject it. And that was the problem I was writing through in that novel. And in a lot of ways, writing it played a key role in bringing me back to the church. But I was not, as of when it was published. For example, if someone had asked me, "Are you a Catholic?" I would say, "I'm an atheist. I was raised a Catholic. I find the tradition still aesthetically powerful," I might have said, but I would not have described myself as that. And then shortly after that, I did return to the church, and I wrote a novel which nobody talks about. And you would think I'd only written 2 novels from the discussion today, but there was one in between called Arts and Entertainments, and that to me is far and away the most, in my view, Catholic of my novels. It's meant to be a sort of Wavian satire, and it is written from a place of trying to criticize the world, the sort of postmodern secular society, shall we say, from a Catholic position. Nobody in these kinds of discussions brings up that book, and that's fine. I think in part the fact that I was not writing it out of a conflict with the church or a confusion with the church made it, for whatever qualities I think it might have, less interesting for a critic like Joshua and the concerns he has to think about through the lens of the Catholic imagination. So that's not a complaint, but I think it's something worth thinking about when we think about the questions that we're here to discuss. And it is always the case that the practicing artist says, "I'm doing my own thing," and these critics are just, taxonomists. And it is always the case that the critics say, in fact, "I read your work, which you don't do, and I can tell you this is what your work is like." And that's all fine, and that's as it should be. So I'm not saying any of this as a criticism, but I think it's particularly worth thinking about when it comes to the novel for this reason. And here I'm going to disagree with some of what you have heard so far. The novel is a secular art form. There is such a thing as the secular. Now, that may be simply a definitional disagreement we have, right? Because there is a sense of the secular that the church has always recognized, right? There are ordered priests and there are secular priests. There is a liturgical calendar, there is a secular calendar, right? There is such a thing as the secular. I don't think that anyone can deny that, right? There is also an idea of secularity or secularism as a space in which the sacred or sacred concerns do not or cannot or ought not appropriately to intrude. And that may be the kind of secular space or the secular you are referring to when you say that there is no secular. But the other kind of secular unquestionably exists, and it is also unquestionably a fact that the history of the novel has run on a track parallel to the growing of the secular as the predominant space in Western life. We all know that the novel emerges in post-Reformation Western Europe at a time when there is a profound reordering of society going on, and it is a reordering towards the secular. We also know, if we accept the sort of benign or non-controversial version of the secular as something, that is, as I said before, we have a secular calendar and we have a liturgical calendar. We are all called upon, in a certain sense, to be living on a secular timeline at the same time as a sacred timeline. It is unquestionably a fact that the novel, as a narrative art form, has dealt with people living their secular lives as its primary subject matter. We also know, since Don Quixote, that one of the major subject matters of the novel has been a kind of disillusionment, has been the process of disillusionment. Right. So, and I think that's important to say because there are one can be a Catholic artist and devote yourself to devotional art forms. One can work within a tradition of the visual arts that has to do with iconography, for example, that is very strongly bound up to a devotional aesthetic tradition. One can write liturgical music. One can write liturgical poetry. This is not what the novelist is doing, and that's why I think Auden's poem is so great. The novelist. So some wonderful poems have been written by saints. As far as I know, there is no great novel that was written by a saint. I have not read Newman's novels. So I don't know, maybe they're so-so, that right. Yeah, and he's probably the best candidate we've got, So because the novelist must be filthy among the filthy and suffer dully all the wrongs of man. And so to be a Catholic artist who has chosen to work in this form, that you've already, taken a certain step that has certain implications to it. I would add that was the adjective used emphatic, or emphatically secular. So the novel isn't or doesn't have to be emphatically secular, and the novelist doesn't need to like the fact that the novel is a secular form. And in fact, a great many novels, many of the greatest, have been written out of a discontent with this fact about the novel. And Dostoevsky comes to mind, but I'm even thinking without getting into matters of religious belief. All of the great 20th century modernists, what they are doing with the novel is trying to make it do something other than recount secular lives. And in particular, they're trying to do it by mapping it onto other forms that have done more elevated work. Okay, so Joyce and Ulysses is the obvious example. Now, Joyce is doing something parodic, he's doing something mock heroic. On the other hand, he spent a substantial chunk of his life as one of the most talented writers in the history of the English language, working on this 400,000 word book. It wasn't just a joke, it wasn't a lark, he was trying to fight against the fact that the form that he was forced to work in was fundamentally a secular form. We see it in Thomas Mann. We see it in Marcel Proust. There is an incredible resistance to the problems with secular time in Proust. Proust understands that there are elevated moments and that flattened secular time has no way of recognizing those things. There are great descriptions of Gothic cathedrals in Proust. There are very comic descriptions of the way that the schedule of the salons have taken over what used to be the Easter season, and has taken over the liturgical calendar. So he is profoundly aware of the cross tensions, as Taylor would put it, that come with living in a secular space. So he does not have to embrace the secular in order to use the secular form. And excuse me. So that leads me into the subject area that I would like us to try and get into a little bit, which is form, which for a practitioner of an art is of utmost importance. But particularly, again, it is a fact about the novel that it is basically formless, or every novel has its own form to it. It is not, it is a genre like poetry, it is not a form like the villanelle. So one of the primary things that any novelist needs to do while writing is figure out what is the form of this novel, and then you send the novel out into the world, and it gets read thematically, which is great, you know, and you've done a lot of work on that front. But the form is the way that the novel is embodied, you know, and so it is of enormous importance to what you're doing. I will just speak briefly about the form of these two novels and the way that the choice, which to me didn't feel like a choice, it was I stumbled into it, and then eventually as you get to a certain point where it solidifies as the form of the book, but the way that these forms express some part of my Catholic imagination, let's say. So What Happened to Sophie Wilder is composed of alternating chapters. The one set of the odd numbered chapters are first-person chapters, and they are in the voice of a young writer named Charlie Blakeman, who has some of my autobiographical details, who has been raised in the Catholic Church and in a devout family, and is now working in New York media as I was, and has left the church, and it is a first-person perspective. The other chapters are from the perspective of the title character Sophie Wilder, but they are in third person. You could do something. Excuse me. you could write a book like this and have it be alternating first person, and lots of people would do that. Right. A particular kind of disembodied third-person narrative is a formal choice that feels less available to people in a godless world, right? Because there is an implication, right, that there is something outside of subjective experience. That thing outside of subjective experience is capable of ordering the world and also is capable of judging us. That man or the first-person I is not the measure of all things. And so to have Sophie's world be a third-person world and Charlie's world be a first-person world, that is an important formal choice. Once I had made that choice, it then allowed me to do things structurally, which those of you who have read the book will know about, but I don't want to get too much into them for those who have not. But suffice to say that gives you some idea of the kind of formal choices that can be made that are that are informed by a writer's metaphysical commitments, ethical commitments, etc. The Index of Self-Destructive Acts has 7 main characters. It's a wide canvas novel, and each one is given the same number of chapters and almost exactly the same amount of page time. Thank you so much. And what's more, I worked very hard to try and give the feeling when you were reading a particular chapter that character was the main character of the novel, right? There's a distinction that Forster draws between flat characters and round characters, and that's a little tendentious, but we all know when we are reading a book and we are reading a scene in which the main character is not present, but that scene only exists to do certain things for the main character's storyline, right? Now, in life, when you and I are having a conversation and Joshua is not in the room, it is not to us about how this is going to affect his story. You know, that's not the way people live their lives. And a person who is treated as merely a character in someone else's story is not, to return us to the subject of this conference, is not being given their dignity. So that was the challenge I set for myself on a formal level in this book was, can I write a book that has 7 plot lines in it? They work together, but they all feel like they're given equal weight, and each character, while you are reading about that character, feels like the main character in the book. And on one level, it sounds like a sort of an aesthetic constraint, almost sort of Oulipian or something like that. Can I do it? But I had a reason for doing it, which has to do with some of the issues that we're talking about. You know, one of the odd things about writing is that you spend a lot of your time problem solving, but it's a strange kind of problem solving because you're solving problems that you have set for yourself. And if you have done the job well enough, the solution completely effaces the underlying problem. And so the reader sees only the solution and not the problem that you set for yourself. So I thought it might be useful to have a sense of the kinds of problems that a writer can set for him or herself, and how they can relate to these questions.
Yeah, well, if I could just briefly respond to some of the things that you're bringing up at the end. I mean, it's reminiscent of what Alistair McIntyre says about the interrelationship of narratives and the way in which we do oftentimes conceive of others as first gentlemen, right, in our lives, whereas we conceive of ourselves as Hamlet. And it's precisely the novel, especially the novel, I would say, as a form that promotes that or encourages it, fosters it. And I do think that I would push back a little bit on this sort of stringent secularity of the novel that you're setting up. I know that you granted that there are some exceptions, and I think you would include in those, you said the modernist, someone like Virginia Woolf, right, where there's a kind of mysticism that she's cultivating that extends far beyond the secular. But I think that the work of Dostoevsky is actually far greater in the sense that it changes what the novel can do after that point, because he's taking this secularized form and taking the detective novel, taking the swashbuckling adventure story and the romantic hero of someone like Dmitri, and he's melding it with hagiography, right? And he's allowing both of those or all of those genres to intermix, the high and the low, very freely. And I would also say that it's sometimes difficult in the case of the Brothers Karamazov to tell who the protagonist is, and I think that's precisely part of his point, is that there kind of isn't one. And that's a defiance of the sort of early novels overemphasis, as Jody Bottom would have it, on the sort of, the Protestant sort of birth of the novel, and I'm oversimplifying here, but what I mean by that is the overemphasis on the salvation of one hero, one individual, and typically actually not the salvation, but the self-actualization of that character, as opposed to their salvation. Whereas for Dostoevsky, right, it's not enough to care about Dmitri or Ivan or Alyosha or Zosima at the expense of any of the others. And their stories, of course, inevitably they are going to become Hamlet for themselves at different points, but they can't remain in that place for very long. And I think that actually that's, you mentioned that I think that that's something similar to what you were up to in the Index of Self-Destructive Acts, is maybe you weren't doing it consciously, but on some level it's written kind of as a departure from or a defiance of the idea of the sole protagonist, which is a very Catholic, I think, kind of understanding the communion of saints.
So I think we can find a fair point of agreement if I go a step further than I did before. I was thinking about George Eliot, who wonderfully describes Dorothea as a Saint Teresa, foundress of nothing, and in her early work, Scenes from Clerical Life is sort of writing about what has happened after the Reformation brought the priestly caste into secular life. And so I would say not only do I allow that it is possible for novelists to push against the secularity of the form. I probably would go so far as to say that all of the most interesting novels in the history of the form have done that in some way or another. All of the great, great novelists. That does not mean that all great novelists have been religious believers. You know, you have a novelist like Beckett, you know, is in his own way pushing against it. But, you know, you think of how dissatisfied Tolstoy was with the novel as a form. I do think all of the most interesting novelists are novelists for whom secularism poses a problem, and the secular nature of the novel poses an artistic problem.
Right, but and at the same time, it's a problem. But I think your point is well taken. That it's also something that is embraced and not ignored or denied, in a kind of romantic aspiration after constant transcendence, if that makes sense, right? So it allows there to be a lot of life that's just lived on the literal level. Sometimes you move beyond the literal into the mystical, but a lot of time you're just sort of spending your days in the literal with the characters. Right?
Chris, you're mentioning George Eliot. It's apropos, because I think of all of T.S. Eliot's critical essays, the best one, with possible exception of tradition and individual talent, is his Religion and Literature, where he says virtually all of English novels act as if religion is just an artifact of a distant past, except for in the case of Mr. James Joyce. But he refers specifically to George Eliot. She's really clearly in his sights. And reading that essay as a young writer, I thought this really is the problem, because just as Kant reduced religion to morality, the novel risks reducing the drama of human existence to sociology. And I think that is the secularizing act, is that it is what Maritain would call a kind of forgetfulness of being, is that human action takes place at a certain kind of social level, and it ceases to soak down into the depths of being, where we're actually confronted with things that transcend us a lot of the times. So I agree with you with that. But just to flip over to another modernist master, that when Auden wrote in Canterbury Pilgrims about why he returned to the church after years as a Marxist Freudian weirdo, he said, well, I was in Spain and I saw the churches closed, and I realized in seeing them closed and shuttered that what was occurring in there had always been very important to me, even though I was never in there. And so the sign of the church itself spoke beyond any kind of sociological intention. And I think it's only at that level where we could push back against the novel as a secular form. I think I would concede everything else you say.
Well, and just briefly, you Mentioned Proust, and he has this wonderful essay called The Death of Cathedrals, where even though he's not a practicing Catholic or believer, he, in La Figaro, right, very publicly defends keeping the cathedrals open in France and how important it is for the common good of the nation, in spite of his own personal lack of belief.
If you don't mind, I just want to add one more thing. I'm thinking about Walker Percy here, because Percy was saying you can't have a great Marxist novel and a great Hindu novel because they don't believe in the incarnation in the same way. And so the particularity, the validation of the mundane and the ordinary by the incarnation to be a vehicle towards transcendence is something that is particularly at the heart of the Catholic faith, in a way that Solzhenitsyn, for example, moving out of Marxism, he realized he couldn't write a Marxist novel. Like, he couldn't write it as a Soviet. He had to write a novel once he became an Orthodox believer again, right? Because of that particularity.
Yeah, I think your remarks remind me of what Eric Auerbach sets out in Mimesis, where he says, right, if you look at sort of the serious treatment of everyday life that you find in Flaubert, you can't imagine that without the gospel first having been written, because in antiquity, right before the gospels, you couldn't treat everyday life in any way except comically, right? And so these characters could be put on stage or put in the poem, but they're not going to be taken seriously. Whereas when you get to something like Peter's denial of Christ, who's a very ordinary, sort of unremarkable person, right, from the vantage point of world historical sort of epic, but he intersects immediately with the person of Christ and with that transcendence.
I wish we had Amit Majumdar here, because as an Indian novelist and poet, he might have something to say to that. But since he's not here, somebody else can ask a question. Would anybody like to? Right back there. And I'm going to repeat the question just for the purpose of the camera.
Sure. I think you're not sort of, it's not a community building art form the same way. You know, it's like there's no full folk music. There are all these songs with no authorship that just grew over time with individual authors, with individual owners. The idea of owning intellectual property, you know, is this something that we can still do today, this particular art form?
Just, can you repeat the question? And then just in
Sure.
response.
Is the novel, because it was written by an individual telling an individual story, is it inherently an individualist art? And I think this is what you were talking about with Jody Bottom. His argument is that it is a Protestant artifact, that it grew out of the Protestant Reformation, which really zeroed in on the personal relationship with Jesus, the individual believer being converted, and that's why you have this like interior look into the mind of the character, the self-expression of the novelist, and all of those things kind of are generated. The unintentional reformations, right, out of the Reformation. And I think with almost anything, I'm always hesitant. I want to like test the veracity of the things I'm saying because I'm an external processor, so take this for what it's worth, and maybe they can say something more brilliant. But I think with almost anything in the Christian tradition, you are dealing with things that are fundamentally broken or tainted and are being redeemed. So things are in process. And that's why a lot of these novels that are so rich and meaningful, they're taking something that is broken and making it better. There's a redemptive move with novels that is happening. And that's why the 20th century Catholic novel is so rich, because it finds that the Catholics have something to say in this form, and it fits so well with their tradition that they kind of take it by force, both in Europe and in Japan and in America, and it becomes this kind of fruitful, fertile ground for them artistically.
I waited so long for this panel, and now it's over. I'm sorry. No, one last question.
Thank you. I'm going to stay seated.
Yes,
because
please do.
I'm right here. Thank you all for your presentations. I have a question about the mundane, which maybe isn't the same thing as a secular. What's the duty of an artist to depict the mundane? I think I don't know if it's actually in there, but my memory of Don Quixote is that there is a conversation about novels between the barber and the priest, and there is some praise for some chivalric novels which depict people sleeping and eating. That's really what would make a good novel or a good work of art. And it sounds very funny. At the same time, sometimes it does feel wrong to keep on showing people art that involves a turn, a sudden change, when a lot of day-to-day life doesn't involve that. It seems like you might be fooling them. What's our duty to depict the mundane as mundane, where there isn't often a turn?
Is that on me? I don't think that artists have much in the way of duty. That's just how I feel about it. Maybe it's just I'm trying to shirk responsibility, But there are certain artists who are very alive to the mundane and can make something great of it, and those people should do that. And there are artists who aren't, and they should not try to do something that it doesn't come naturally to them out of a sense of duty.
I would also add that, I think implicit in the kind of premise that you're setting forth is that because much of human life is mundane, therefore novels have to, if they're going to be good, realistically imitate that mundane. And I think that there's a certain kind of school of realism that does advocate that, right? That the goal of life is to just sort of accurately depict most most unremarkable human lives. But I don't know that I would want, and there's a place for that, but I think when if we were to turn to novels just to see a kind of confirmation of the sort of unremarkability or mundanity that much of our lives consist of, then we're kind of ignoring the other the possibility of a novel as that which sort of sets forth what's probable or plausible beyond what's real or realistic. And then I'll just leave it at that for now.
I'm just going to end with a praise to God, because I don't think there is anything ordinary in this world. I think every single moment is charged with a sacramental availability. I think everything is charged with the Spirit being able to move, mystery through manners. And so I think that if we open ourselves up instead to seeing things as mundane, seeing them as capable of a higher realism, as Dostoevsky would say, I think that that kind of vision is more true than a vision which sees things as mundane or sacred.
And with that, since she has lifted our minds and hearts up to God, we will we will continue the ascent. Thank you.